Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Syria's Bashar al-Assad flees to Moscow after a stunningly fast advance by opposition groups topples his regime. The end of 50 years of the Assad family's rule leaves a power vacuum, raising concerns of more turmoil and violence. Israeli ground forces reportedly crossed into Syrian territory for the first time since the 1973 October War. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the collapse of the Assad regime offers, quote, great opportunity. And Korean stocks and the won slide as pressure intensifies on President Yoon to step down despite avoiding impeachment. Police reportedly saying he could face arrest under certain conditions. Well, it's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Joanna Bersetchi in Abu Dhabi today, and I'm here for Abu Dhabi Finance Week, which begins this morning. And later this hour, do not miss my interview with the UBS Group CEO Sergio Ermotti. That is at 8:45 a.m. Dubai time. But for most of this show, we're going to be talking about these stunning developments that have happened in the Middle East over the course of this weekend. At the end of the Assad regime, after more than 50 years in power, what happens next? Who fills up the vacuum? What does it mean for the region? These are all questions that we're going to be attempting to answer throughout the course of this show. But as ever, let's just kick off taking a look at how markets are faring, because we saw yet another record high for the S&P. NFP numbers coming in line with expectations, well, slightly higher. 227,000 was the headline print, but unemployment rate also increasing to 4.2%. So something in it for both the hawks and the doves. What it does mean is that the markets are still centered on that interest rate cut coming through at the December meeting. So S&P futures another high. Today futures not doing that much. And NASDAQ also trading sideways, slightly to the downside, down about 6 basis points. Brent also in focus. We can slip. We have slipped a little bit. We're around $71.50. This after some downward pressure came through after that OPEC Plus decision last week to delay the putback of barrels to the market by another 3 months. And despite the geopolitical risk, again, still struggling to maintain some stability here. And then gold also in focus. Again, given the geopolitical developments over the weekend, we have seen some money going into the gold bullion, up 0.2%. Also reports that China last month resumed buying gold too. So something to bear in mind there. And for our terminal chart today, attention is going to focus this week on central bank meetings. We've got the ECB on Thursday, but also CPI data coming up in the U.S. And just on that point, it is interesting to know that we are seeing sticky inflation, a sticky inflation trend at this point. So whether we get an upside surprise here, again, will be a big factor for markets and something that investors are watching very closely, given that short-term inflation has been trending above 2% for both 3-month and 6-month annualized. All right, let's also check in on how markets in Asia are faring. Avril Hong is in our Singapore studio, also monitoring political developments in South Korea. Avril, in addition to some of the data that's coming through from China this morning.
Absolutely. We are focused on South Korea and China today. South Korea after the failed impeachment motion over the weekend, and that's raising these concerns of a prolonged political crisis in the country that's affecting assets across the board in South Korea. Look at the Kosdaq, the small cap gauge, that's really been underperforming versus the benchmark Kospi. And as some of our analysts have pointed out, this tells you that even retail investors are exiting stocks. It gives you a sense of the sentiment in the country. The Korean won, weakest level against the greenback in more than 2 years. Even Korea bonds are not really catching a safe haven bid, which tells you that investors are applying a discount to all things South Korea. Meantime, China, we also got data today that showed an unexpected slowing in inflation, telling you how stimulus efforts just haven't been enough, and Chinese stocks are under pressure today as well. Joanna.
Yep, and more pressure on those authorities to do with more on the stimulus side. Avril Hong in Singapore, thank you very much for the overview. Well, turning to the big story over here in the region, after more than a decade of civil war, 600,000 deaths, and the world's worst refugee crisis since World War II, Syria's Bashar al-Assad has been toppled, ending more than 50 years of the Assad family rule. The Syrian president fled to Russia after a lightning rebel advance led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham entered Damascus on Saturday evening and captured the key city of Homs around the same time. Russian state agency TASS says Assad and his family arrived in Moscow, where they were granted asylum. Stuart Livingston-Wallace is Bloomberg's executive editor for Middle East, North Africa, and Russia, and joins us now. Well, it's been a busy weekend for everybody, but Stuart, maybe just talk us through how quickly the demise of the Assad regime took place. It was only a week ago that we started to talk about these advances from rebels led by HTS, and now here we are, almost a week, 10 days later, and are staring at the end of the Assad regime.
Yeah, I mean, it fundamentally comes down to when you start counting it from. I think you would find a constituency out there that said it took 5 decades to get rid of them. But, in terms of the more immediate past, yeah, it was less than 2 weeks. And I think it was what surprised everyone was the speed at which it happened on a number of fronts. So number one, that the opposition forces, and there are many, many of them, managed to unify and work together and move very rapidly. Secondly, at how weak the Assad regime proved to be when under a little bit of pressure. And then the third really important thing is how reluctant both Russia and Iran were to step in, because there was certainly an assumption among some analysts that Russia would absolutely intervene, and that just didn't happen.
What do we know about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham? They're known as HTS. The leader gave a speech yesterday. He also gave an interview with an American outlet last week, trying to shed off some of their perhaps original ties with al-Qaeda. But what do we know about this group, Stuart?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, they've attempted to sort of reform themselves and present a more moderate face. And I mean, there certainly is evidence on the ground in the last several days that they are legitimately trying to do that. Whether that lasts is a different matter. But they have been putting out, rather strict instructions not to enter institutions, to protect the minorities, not to fire into the air. So again, they're certainly trying to project that more moderate face. But the reality is they remain designated as a terrorist group by just about everyone out there. And I think that is the big concern going forward, is not just this group, but some of the other groups in Syria. Can they reform their behavior to the extent that you can actually have a resumption of a civil government in Syria, and it becomes a credible, unified territory going forward?
Yeah, and that is the big question. I'm going to put it to our next guest, Bloomberg's Stuart Livingston-Wallace. Thank you very much. All right, for more analysis, let's bring in Natasha Hall, Senior Fellow at the CSIS Middle East Program. Good to have you with us, Natasha. Let me just start off by asking you, what do you think actually happens next? Who is going to fill the vacuum and the essential governing structure that the Assad regime has presided over for more than 50 years now? What happens next in Syria?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Jomana, at this very historic moment. We're looking at the end of 54 years of Assad rule. So it remains to be seen, I think, what will take its place. But that said, HTS, in coming into Aleppo, Syria's second largest city, and in Damascus, has said that institutions will remain in place. Government employees will, for the most part, remain in their positions. And so everything will function as usual, but hopefully better this time. The HTS forces have also accepted the defections of Syrian security forces even, and allowed them to essentially stay in their positions or grant amnesty. Whether or not that continues in some of the Assad regime strongholds in Latakia and Tartus, we've seen some evidence of that. But again, we'll have to see in the days and weeks ahead. And certainly there's going to be tensions between different rebel factions, between the outside formal opposition, who has very little influence on the ground, and those that have remained in the country for over a decade throughout this war.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting yesterday that Jolani, we were just talking about him, the leader of HTS, gave a speech at the Umayyad Mosque, and in it, he spoke about this new triumph. It marks a new chapter in the history of the region, a history fraught with dangers. And then he specifically mentions Syria being a playground for Iranian ambitions. Now, many outlets are picking up on that line because it seems to suggest that he would like a break from the historic close ties that the Assad regime enjoyed with Iran. How should we read it?
Well, I think without a doubt, Jolani and all Syrians want a break from Iranian influence. I mean, listeners cannot forget that it was primarily the Iranian regime and its proxies like Hezbollah that really came in to help the regime besiege populations, bombard them, shell them. And so certainly I think most Syrians would like a break from Iranian influence in the country. Even, I think pro-Assad regime factions and supporters were not very happy about the growing Iranian influence in the country. So we'll see if Iran becomes a spoiler in the future, but I think as of now, there are few Syrians on the ground that really want to lend a hand to Iran at the moment.
What do you think is going to happen when Trump steps into office? Many people are watching out for comments that he put out over the weekend, sort of suggesting that they're watching what's happening, or the Trump administration is watching what's happening very closely, but kind of want to pursue a hands-off approach. Can the U.S. pursue a hands-off approach in Syria?
That is the truly big question, because in the Trump administration, or at least in the nominees that we've heard, we've seen everyone from Tulsi Gabbard, who has actually met with Bashar al-Assad, to Marco Rubio, who has a very hawkish stance on Iran and other issues in the region. That said, we did see this tweet from President-elect Trump himself, essentially saying that hands off Syria, this isn't our problem. But the fact remains that there are thousands of ISIS prisoners in northeast Syria. And those prisons are guarded by Kurdish-dominated forces in the northeast that are backed by the United States. So, I mean, ISIS is amongst the many spoilers in this, but certainly one of the more concerning ones. So we can't really tell what this administration is going to do, how radically it would sort of withdraw from Syria. But this is another really big concern, I think, for everyone in the region and Syrians themselves.
Yeah. And many people are talking about the fact that HTS have been releasing prisoners from jail. And of course, some of those prisoners are actually ISIS prisoners. Let me just ask you another question about Turkey and President Erdogan here. Again, lots of reports of the weekend suggesting he may have given tacit approval to the rebel forces to continue with their advance, if not explicit. Do you think he's going to use this turmoil in leadership now in Syria to extract concessions in that Kurdish region up in the northeast?
Yeah, I mean, Turkey is really the big winner in all of this. They didn't have much of a role to play in the actual offensive, but they certainly must have green-lighted something for HTS and the Syrian National Army, or the SNA. This is the hodgepodge of rebel groups that Turkey backs in northern Syria. And frankly, they are already taking advantage. We're seeing clashes between Kurdish forces and the SNA in northern Syria, and this is a really growing concern. I think that potentially Erdogan could use this to create a buffer zone completely across the Syrian border to mitigate what he sees as a Kurdish threat coming from Syria. And so I think this is another thing, in addition to the ISIS prisons that are in the vicinity, that are of real concern. And it's not clear that HTS or Jolani can really control these factions that are engaged in these clashes in the north.
Yeah, most definitely. Well, Turkey, one of the winners out of this. And Natasha Hall, Senior Fellow at the CSIS Middle East Program, thank you so much for staying up late and coming on our show today. Well, still ahead, hear why BlackRock Investment Institute is seeing investment opportunities in AI. More on their market strategy next. This is Bloomberg.
can't guarantee anything. I can't guarantee tomorrow. But I can say that if you look at just pre-COVID, we had the greatest economy in the history of our country. And I had a lot of tariffs on a lot of different countries, but in particular China, we took in hundreds of billions of dollars, and we had no inflation.
That was President-elect Donald Trump talking about his favorite word in the dictionary, U.S. tariffs. Well, this morning, Asian stocks are slipping as investors grapple with South Korea's deepening political crisis and await fresh stimulus from Beijing. Meanwhile, oil rose after the Syrian government collapsed. So lots going on in overnight markets. Let's bring in Ben Powell, Chief Middle East and APAC Investment Strategist at BlackRock Investment Institute. There's a sort of a music backdrop to our conversation here, so let's sort of lean into that. Yes. There's been a bit of a party going on since the U.S. election. Stock markets going from strength to strength. Yes. Do you see that continuing into next year?
Yeah, festival atmosphere here in Abu Dhabi, and a lot of people enjoying themselves at this amazing event. And you're right, markets continue to power on. To your question, yes, we at BlackRock, we are still pretty optimistic. We are overweight US equities, continue to be so. We're very conscious that valuations are not obviously cheap. I think that's true and important. But for now, the combination of the deregulatory excitement, which is real, at least the excitement is real. We'll have to see how the policies play out. But the deregulatory excitement combined with the artificial intelligence megaforce, as we call it, is continuing to drive US equities, and it feels like that momentum is going to continue for some time to come. Yeah,
I mean, we say that, but then equally, we're speaking from Abu Dhabi. This region over the weekend, massive political developments. I mean, not that Bashar al-Assad has any influence on global markets, but still, it's just another case in point of all of these tectonic shifts that are taking place at the same time. Do you worry about perhaps there being geopolitical headwinds to market direction in 2025?
As a global citizen, I worry. As an asset manager, we just have to move to acceptance and deal with the world as it is. So I think this kind of, as you put it so well, Joanna, tectonic shifts that we're seeing all over the world is just a fact now. So I think what's critical, and when we think about our 2025 outlook, we're talking about transformation. There's so much more going on than just the kind of normal cyclical frame of, are the Fed going to do this or that? That's still very important. But we're having these seismic shifts in the economy with artificial intelligence, with the energy transition. And I think, yes, geopolitically and politically, and that's going to continue. So I think, as I say, as citizens of the world, there's lots to be worried about. But as investors, we just need to accept that's how it is and try and navigate accordingly.
Yeah, let me just ask you a question about geographies as well. I feel as though people are turning so negative on the outlook for European equities, the state of the European economy, the politics also there, holding back key nations. Are you also of the view that U.S. outperformance is just going to continue, or because valuations are so cheap in European equities, are you seeing this as a potential entry point?
So we are still overweight the U.S. and we are still underweight Europe. So I guess, therefore, we think that the divergence can continue. Europe, I should say, has got some great companies, individual companies with global exposures, which in a way just kind of happen to be listed in Europe. So we need to be a little bit nuanced about distinguishing between Europe and European equities. They're not exactly the same thing, but it does feel like the mood music in Europe is going to continue to be a bit tricky, given French and likely German political, how can we say, complexity over the next month or two. So some great companies, but in aggregate, still a bit tricky in Europe, we think.
Yeah. So going back to the U.S. economy, let's just talk about the state of the U.S. economy per se. We've talked about markets. We had the NFP number come through on Friday, suggesting the labor market still seems to be holding off. The average of job gains over the last couple of months is still north of 150,000. Unemployment rate still close to 4%. Should the Fed be cutting in this environment?
It seems like they want to. So again, we shouldn't deal in what should, we deal in what is, and we think they are minded to cut. So we think they're going to cut a couple more times, probably to about 4%, which is our assessment of neutral. But what's quite interesting, I think, Joanna, is since they started cutting, since they started hiking, 2 years ago, we really didn't see any slowdown in the economy, not really, and we actually saw a loosening of financial market conditions. So again, it seems like it's a very different macroeconomic environment where the normal cyclical lens is not enough to explain what's going on. When we think about the strength of the US economy, it is things like the AI revolution which is driving them. So for us, again, for BlackRock, really focusing on the bigger structural changes we think is critical, even at a tactical asset price performance level.
What does that do to the USD? Is this U.S. exception isn't going to translate to a stronger greenback in coming years as well?
It has so far, and we think that is likely to continue. So in a world that is fragmenting, you're going to see fragmented monetary policy. And by the way, that's quite normal. If you go back over the last several hundred years, it wasn't always the case that every central bank was doing the same thing on the same day. So we should see some of that in the next several quarters. I would think, for example, the ECB probably have more room to cut. Growth dynamics there look a little bit slower, frankly. So we can probably see a divergence between the Fed. I don't want to say hawkish. They're definitely not hawkish. They're cutting, but perhaps not so much. ECB and others probably have more room for cutting. That leads to divergence, which as investors we should be mindful of, including for the currency.
Are you doing much in China?
We are, yeah, so we are still overweight China equities. It is the world's second largest economy, a huge market, of course, so we as the world's largest asset manager by far, of course, have some thoughts around it. For China, we all as investors, I guess, were excited after the big Politburo meeting back on September the 24th, and we're now in a maximally uncomfortable moment, it seems to me, Joanna, where we're all waiting for the big reveal. We have the Economic Work Conference later this week.
Yes.
Probably not yet, so we probably don't get the big fiscal reveal that we're all hoping for, in particular to drive the consumer side. I would think that's a Q1, Q2 thing, but for now, Chinese equities are just so cheap that we're ready to be a little bit overweight as we wait for that hoped-for positive catalyst.
Yeah, well, certainly the inflation data this morning is sort of emphasizing the case for further policy stimulus and tariffs potentially next year. Ben, going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining our show today. A real pleasure to speak to you. Ben Powell, Chief Middle East and APAC Investment Strategist at Chief Middle East and APAC Investment Strategist at BlackRock, I should say. Thank you. All right, coming up, a $765 million deal, reportedly the biggest ever in sports history. We'll bring you that from the U.S. and a roundup of some of today's other stories. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joanna Bersecci in Abu Dhabi today. And now for a look at some of the other stories we're following. It is reported that Juan Soto has signed a 15-year contract with the New York Mets worth a cool $765 million. According to ESPN, the deal for the 26-year-old superstar outfielder is the largest in professional sports history. And Saudi Arabia is cutting oil prices for Asian buyers by more than expected. A price list seen by Bloomberg shows that Aramco will sell its main Arab Light crude to Asia at a premium of 90 cents a barrel in January, 10 cents cheaper than expected by traders and down from a $1.70 premium this month. Oil has been under pressure with a lower risk premium and on sluggish demand. Quick look at equity futures before we head out to the break. When we come back, we're going to be talking about developments in South Korea alongside the Middle East region. We'll be back. Good morning. This is Horizons Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Syria's Bashar al-Assad flees to Russia as rebels topple his regime. Israeli ground forces reportedly crossed into Syrian territory for the first time since 1973. Ghana's opposition leader John Mahama is set to win Saturday's presidential elections, with the ruling party conceding defeat. And we're live, in case you didn't hear it, from Abu Dhabi Finance Week, which begins this morning. UBS Group CEO Sergio Ermotti joins me live on set. That is in about 15 minutes. Well, it's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Joanna Bersecci in Abu Dhabi. We're here for Abu Dhabi Finance Week. Plenty of guests that we're going to be speaking to over the course of the next couple of days, and some panels that I'll be moderating too as well. So stay tuned for some of the highlights. But a quick look at markets today. Futures not doing a whole lot. We've got the S&P and the Nasdaq dipping a little bit, but another record high for the S&P on Friday. Those NFP numbers came in line, slightly stronger than expectations on headline, but unemployment rate did see an uptick. But what that means is it cements the case for many for that December rate cut. So that is the focus for the investment community going into the December Fed meeting, in addition to CPI numbers this week, which are going to give further clues as well. Brent also in focus. We continue to see some downward pressure on the energy complex ever since that OPEC Plus decision to delay putting back extra barrels to the market, and also despite the fact that, of course, we've seen a flaring up of geopolitical developments in the Middle East over the region over the weekend. So Brent hanging in at around $71, a big figure. And then gold also in focus. Given the developments over the weekend, we did see a bit of money come in to the bullion. We're trading just north of $2,600, so trading in the green this morning too. As for the other highlights for markets, well, also remember that Thursday is going to be ECB day. And the markets have pulled away from their view that they're going to go for a 50 basis point cut this week, but 28 basis points is what is priced in. So a lot of pressure is building on the European economy as we head into 2025. How did the ECB react? That is a question for Thursday. All right, let's push on and also check in on how markets in Asia are faring. Avril is in our Singapore studio. Avril, give us a run through of how some of these Asian markets are performing, specifically what is going on in South Korea.
Yeah, absolutely, Jumana. I mean, those events over the weekend, that failed impeachment motion of the South Korean president and how he just narrowly averted being unseated. I think that's the main concern for investors, given how there's public anger. The opposition is also still seeking his impeachment. This sets the stage for a prolonged political crisis. So I thought I'd just highlight what we're seeing in South Korea stocks, because the KOSDAQ, the small cap gauge in the country, not only is at the lowest since April 2020, it's also this line in white showing you how it has been underperforming the benchmark KOSPI of late. This chart, courtesy of MLife's Mark Cranfield, tells you that this is really a rare occurrence, and it also shows you how retail investors as well, not just foreign investors, have been exiting South Korean stocks. So even though valuations are cheap, it doesn't look like they expect a turnaround anytime soon. So putting that South Korea stock market loss into perspective for you today, Jumana.
Yeah, well, 2.5% lower on the KOSPI. That tells you a lot about how investors are thinking about these markets and the risk premium there. Avril Hong, thank you so much. Now, the New York Times is reporting that Israeli ground forces have overtly crossed into Syrian territory for the first time since the October War in 1973. Israeli ground forces reportedly advanced beyond the demilitarized zone to take control of the summit of Mount Hermon on the Syrian side of the border. The Israeli military says it is not interfering with internal events in Syria, but adds its forces will continue to operate as long as necessary to preserve the buffer zone and defend Israel. So stunning developments over the weekend in Syria with the end of more than 50 years of the Assad regime. And you're already seeing some of the regional countries respond, including the likes of Israel. And South Korean stocks have slumped more than 2.2% as traders brace for volatility due to the deepening political turmoil. Yonhap News reports that police may seek the emergency arrest of President Yoon if conditions are met. The president managed to avoid impeachment over the weekend by a handful of votes, but pressure on him continues to intensify. Let's speak to Bloomberg's Katya Dimitrieva. Really interesting that Yoon actually survived this impeachment vote. What is his status now? Where do things stand?
Well, Yoon is in a highly unstable position right now that just is intensifying sort of by the hour. So even though the impeachment vote failed, there's, of course, growing protests on the streets of Seoul and in other major cities. The Democratic Party, that's the main opposition, and their allies have actually promised to hold another vote to impeach on Wednesday. That's going to be a special session of Parliament. But it's kind of, the noose is tightening from kind of all around on President Yoon. So police have opened up this special investigation. It takes months or years, but just the fact that they've opened it and there's a lot on the table, they've said they could potentially ban Yoon from traveling overseas. And if the evidence stacks up, basically, that they could potentially arrest him. So a lot of uncertainty there. Meanwhile, what's really interesting is from his own party. So even though they boycotted the vote on Saturday. That's members of the PPP, the ruling party. The leader is now coming out and saying, for all intents and purposes, Yoon is not really managing the country right now. It's actually the prime minister and the party. So as you can see, there's a lot of uncertainty, and time seems, at least right now, like it's limited for President Yoon.
Yeah, Katya, what is the opposition actually looking to do after their motion to impeach failed over the weekend? What are they going to do to mobilize?
Well, they're holding another vote on Wednesday, so there will be this special emergency session of Parliament. And also we're hearing from unions, some very big unions, some of the country's biggest, that will be looking to strike that same day. Now, they're also looking for their own incentives. They're also looking for higher wages and to address a couple other issues. But it's very clear that the Democratic Party is really trying to galvanize the support that's out on the street and from unions right now to get the ball moving. And so we could see some of that development in the next 48 hours.
Katya, thank you so much for the overview of what's going on. Bloomberg's Katya Dimitrieva, thanks. Well, coming up, UBS CEO Sergio Ermotti joins us to discuss how the latest developments in the Middle East will impact markets. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joanna Versace in Abu Dhabi today for Abu Dhabi Finance Week. We are live here. It is the third edition of the event, and it is looking to explore the power of financial, human, and technological capital as a competitive propeller for economic growth. So to talk about all of these things and more is Sergio Ermotti, the CEO at UBS. It's good to have you with us over here in Abu Dhabi. It's a little different from Par de Plate. Let me just start off by asking you, what brings you to Abu Dhabi? I mean, clearly your presence in the region has picked up since the merger. Talk to us about your expansion efforts in the Middle East.
But of course, the Abu Dhabi Finance Week is a great opportunity to be here and reconfirm our commitment to this region, which is fast growing. I think that we, with 5 trillion of assets, is growing faster than Europe. It's very fascinating to see what's going on here. So it's a great opportunity.
Yeah. In the last couple of months, I've been speaking to other bank CEOs, some of your American peers, and they've also been talking about establishing RHQs in Saudi Arabia. Are you also thinking about expanding beyond the UAE into other parts of the Middle East as well, maybe Saudi Arabia too?
Well, we are quite well positioned in the region. We have operations other than in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, but also in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, and in Bahrain. So I think that for the time being, what we are focused on is integration of the Credit Suisse and UBS operations. We have reinforced our presence here, so that's the main priority, is to really connect the Middle East with the rest of the global franchise. Yeah,
talking about the integration of your businesses, next year is going to be a big one because you've got the data migration happening in Switzerland. I know you started in Hong Kong already. How worried are you about how that's all going to go in 2025?
So things are moving well after Luxembourg, Singapore, Hong Kong. Switzerland is going to be the next phase. We are migrating 110 petabytes of data, which 1 petabyte is 500 billions of A4 pages. So that's quite complex. I'm worried in a healthy way, like one has to be worried about such a technical migration, but we are well prepared. So, and this is the last the second half of the migration, and then hopefully in the early part of 2026 we're going to be fully operational under one platform.
Yeah, and as far as the integration is going, just looking at everything, I mean, you're more than half of the way there on cost savings. It really does feel as though, as far as you're concerned, things are moving in line with the path that you had set out.
Yes, I think that I'm very pleased with the progress we've made also on restructuring the balance sheet and repositioning the business. Most importantly, we did all that by staying close to clients, also delivering solid results in the last few quarters, and so we we now really focus on the next phase, which is growth. After this integration, we're going to want to grow, and we start to invest in technology and making sure that we are well prepared for the future.
Are you worried that maybe one of the byproducts of all of this data mitigation and client migration, data migration, I should say, that one of the byproducts could be you could potentially lose clients in the process?
I mean, we take all the necessary steps to make sure that this is not happening. So the team is well prepared, very focused. So I'm not overly concerned about that matter. But there is no room for complacency in those kind of migrations.
Yeah, the Swiss government's about to publish the findings on the investigation into the takeover of Credit Suisse. Are you bracing yourself for the results of those findings and anything that you will be anticipated to do on the back of it?
I'm looking forward to see the report. We hope the necessary transparency will be provided on the reasons why Credit Suisse went down. We do believe it's absolutely crucial to fully understand that before moving into any changes of regulations or any steps that could undermine the competitiveness of the financial center.
Do you worry that perhaps Switzerland is moving to a place where the regulation may be over-onerous versus other jurisdictions around the world?
Yes, I am, but on the other hand, I'm still hopeful that some reasoning and proportionate outcome will come out, will prevail. But I have to say, for the time being, I'm hearing less facts, more emotions driving the debate, and hopefully things are going to cool off in the next few months.
The last time you spoke to Bloomberg TV, you said that one of your major concerns in 2025 was the flaring up of geopolitical risks. And of course, we're sitting here in the Middle East. We've seen another massive weekend. Earlier, I was speaking with a guest on how Assad himself and the regime isn't going to have a direct knock-on effect on global markets. But I do wonder whether, from your perspective, you actually do think that geopolitics could be the major headwind to markets in 2025.
I'm relieved and surprised to see how all these geopolitical events haven't really triggered any more chain events and consequences, also in financial markets. So that's positive. So I think that but one cannot be complacent. The acceleration of geopolitical events coupled with potential escalations on the macroeconomic front, tariff, protectionism, it's definitely something that has to be watched. On the other hand, we still see consumers and the economy quite resilient despite all these challenges. So, but we have to watch carefully those developments and not to be complacent.
How do you see the outlook for the global economy next year? It feels as though you're going to get like pockets of growth. The U.S. perhaps one of them, Europe less so. How do you square it all together?
Well, if you look at the fact that rates may come off, inflation seems to be under control for the time being, and potential deregulation in the U.S. Fostering M&A activity, that could be beneficial for the economy and for markets. On the other hand, as we mentioned, the tariff may create some potential inflationary consequences. So. It's still very uncertain. I do believe that next year we're going to still continue to see a lot of volatility in financial markets, and therefore one has to be very diversified and look at opportunities to deploy cash in a diversified manner.
What would you say the risk-taking appetite is for UBS clients right now?
Well, risk appetite is balanced. I do believe that we see for clients opportunities to redeploy cash as we expect rates to come off. But I would say that not a lot of risk appetite in this environment. Balanced and diversification is key.
You mentioned earlier perhaps the deregulation drive that's going to be spearheaded out of the U.S. with the advent of the Trump administration. What knock-on effect is it going to have on the European banking industry, on the Swiss banking industry, if you have this deregulatory drive or less onerous regulation coming out of the U.S.? Again, it comes back to my original question about competitiveness.
Well, I think it's difficult to see. I think that it's a fact that Europe and in general, including Switzerland, are quite slow to react to what's going on in the U.S. I think that in such an environment, I don't really expect a lot of deregulation, but probably less regulation and more an ability to go through M&A, and that could probably change a little bit the picture, even outside the U.S.
Are you expecting deal making to pick up next year then?
I do expect some M&A to materialize. Also in Europe, we do see consolidation happening more at domestic level, but it could also be that some of this will translate into cross-border.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about that. In UniCredit, obviously, have been quite active cross-border, domestically. Do you see this as a positive development for the European banking industry, that some form of consolidation has started to happen?
In general, yes, but I mean, at the end of the day, in order to really foster consolidation in Europe, you need to have a banking union. You need to have a more solid approach to consolidation. So at this stage, it's a kind of domestic consolidation, but of course, it's far from being a good model that can expand it to more realities in the banking landscape in Europe.
Yeah, and just a final question for you, since we're going to end on Europe and this consolidation push that has been happening. Many people have been talking about the Draghi competitiveness report and what Europe needs to do to sort of catch up in terms of productivity. Do you think that Europe has the right focus now to do what it takes to get the economy back to speed again?
Unfortunately, I don't think there is the right focus at this stage. It seems to me that Europe is much more preoccupied at country level to address their own political worries, and there is less focus on the European project. So. Yeah. I'm afraid, it looks like a very good piece of work that has very good ideas, but is unlikely to be implemented in the short term.
Difficult to implement as ever. Sergio, it's really great to chat to you.
Thank you.
Sergio Ermotti, the CEO at UBS here at Abu Dhabi Finance Week. Well, coming up, Ghana's opposition leader is bound for victory in presidential elections as voters punish the ruling party over its handling of debt and inflation. More on the results next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Abu Dhabi. Well, Ghana's opposition leader, John Mahama, is poised to win the presidential election. Voters ousting the ruling party for failing to manage a crushing debt burden and the fastest pace of inflation in more than 2 decades. The governing New Patriotic Party's candidate, Mahamudu Bawumia, has conceded defeat, citing the need to preserve peace and avoid tension. For more, Bloomberg's anchor and Chief Africa correspondent Jennifer Zabazaja joins us in Johannesburg. Jen, what more do we know about what's going to happen with Ghana? And it seems as though a victory is in sight.
A victory is in sight, definitely, Jumana, and I think it's pretty surprising for many people to see that we did hear from the vice president conceding defeat and congratulating John Mahama potentially on his victory. But we should note that we're still waiting on the official results from the election commissioner. They are meant to come within the 72-hour window after the polls post on Saturday. But yes, generally it is looking like John Mahama is cruising to that victory. And really the interesting point here is we're seeing a similar story as to what we've also seen in other countries globally, really, but also across the continent. So we saw something similar in Botswana, in Senegal, and in Mauritius. And it is voters that are just dissatisfied with the ruling party, with the cost of living. And as you mentioned, we saw inflation in Ghana quicken upwards of 54%. It came back down to about 25%, but still that's quite high for a number of Ghanaians. We saw debt also skyrocket above $51 billion, and the currency, the cedi, was weakened almost 60% against the dollar. And so this has really become a detrimental place for a lot of Ghanaians. And we heard John Mahama use that really as his push and his messaging against the ruling party, saying that it would just be a continuation of what we've been seeing in the past. Clearly, voters potentially voting against a continuation and for a change.
Yeah, what do we know about the economic priorities then of John Mahama, given some of the issues that you just spelled out, including the high debt burden?
Right. It's really interesting. You know, Bloomberg actually had an interview with John Mahama not too long ago, and he talked about how he would actually want to talk to the IMF and rethink what they've decided on for their restructuring terms. He also thinks the past 8 years have not been a conducive business environment, namely for oil and gas producers. And so he wants to see more companies coming back into the country for an upstream, or in an upstream basis, but also in any other ways that they can, because he says that we've seen a lot of businesses flocking. There's also gold that is significant for Ghana. It's Africa's biggest gold producer. Illegal gold mining has been an issue that we've heard these candidates talk about. And cocoa is something that's very crucial to their exports. And so we've heard John talk about a few of the restructuring terms that he would talk about in order to just stabilize the debt and get the country back on stable footing. We did see bonds rising as a result of that as markets priced in his win, but we'll wait to see what happens.
Excellent, Jen. Well, we'll circle back to you in a couple of minutes for the second hour of Horizons. Before we do that, a quick look at equity futures. And we're not doing a whole lot this morning. We are leaning towards the red, dipping somewhat after those NFP print figures came through on Friday. But coming up in our next hour, Syga Thomas from Ensah Advisory Partners and Dalia Fahmy from Long Island University. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. This is Horizons Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Syria's Bashar al-Assad flees to Moscow after a stunningly fast advance by opposition groups topples his regime. The end of 50 years of the Assad family's rule leaves a power vacuum, raising concerns of more turmoil and violence. Israeli ground forces reportedly crossed into Syrian territory for the first time since the 1973 October War. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the collapse of the Assad regime offers, quote, great opportunity. And Korean stocks on the one side as pressure intensifies on President Yoon to step down despite avoiding impeachment. Police reportedly saying he could face arrest under certain conditions. Well, good morning. It's just gone 9 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Joanna Versace in Abu Dhabi with all of the speakers of the Abu Dhabi Finance Week behind me today, Jennifer.
Yeah, and it looks very exciting there, like things are getting going. So looking forward to more of those conversations. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg, where it has just gone at 7 a.m. Welcome to the second hour of Horizons Middle East and Africa.
Well, yes, it's been quite a monumental weekend over here in the Middle East. We're keeping a close eye on the developments in Syria, the end of the Assad regime, lots of questions about what is going to be happening next. And we are going to put those questions to our guests in the next hour. But for now, markets, as ever, S&P coming off a record high. NFP print was in focus on Friday. Also cements the case, some people are saying, for a December rate cut out of the Fed. About 18 basis points are priced in going into that meeting. But this morning, futures not doing a whole lot. We've got the S&P and the Nasdaq tilting towards the red, down 7-8 basis points respectively. Attention turns to CPI figures on Wednesday. I'll get to that in a moment. But also, let's just take a look at the energy complex this morning, because oil seeing a bit of support here, up 0.4%, but the theme has been one of further downward pressure, even after OPEC Plus announced that they're delaying the decision to put extra barrels back to the market by another 3 months. Gold also marginally outperforming today, up 0.1% on a safe haven status, geopolitical risk. As for the inflation picture, I think this is quite an interesting chart going into Wednesday, because it suggests that the inflation figures coming through from the U.S. have actually proven to be quite sticky over the course of the last couple of months. And if you look at these numbers, headline CPI and 3-month annualized rate is actually above 2%. So this is slightly higher than the Fed's target. So something to bear in mind as we get those CPI figures on Wednesday. All right, let's move on and talk about how Asian markets are faring. Avril Hong is in our Singapore studio. Avril, just run us through how these markets are faring today.
Yeah, Jumana, we're watching out for those US CPI numbers. We already got some of those Chinese prices today, and that shows you that unexpected slowing in consumer inflation in the country. Clearly, weak demand that's raising the speculation or expectation that policymakers are going to start deploying fiscal firepower, especially with a key economic meeting that's set to get underway this week. We have the CSI 300, the Hang Seng. We're back from the lunch break in China. They're still sitting quite negative, but pairing some of the earlier losses. I also wanted to highlight what we're seeing in South Korea amid the failed impeachment motion. Clearly, given the public anger, I think the expectation is that this could drag on for a while longer. And the Kosdaq has been underperforming versus the benchmark in the country. And something that our stocks team has been highlighting is that we saw this similarly in 2016, 2017, when politicians were similarly seeking the impeachment of then President Park Geun-hye. The difference this time around is that South Korean retail investors might be more inclined to switch out of Korean equities and into US stocks and cryptocurrency. So that doesn't bode well for stock markets in the country. Guys.
Fascinating picture there. Avril, we'll check back in with you later. Avril Hong in Singapore for us. Now, the world is still trying to grasp the speed of events in recent days, which led to the collapse of a ruling dynasty that controlled Syria for more than half a century. Bashar al-Assad fled to Moscow after armed opposition forces entered the capital, Damascus, on Saturday evening, effectively ending 13 years of civil war that claimed thousands of lives. And while the implications of the regime change are still unfolding, the international community is warning of chaos and division in the region. For more, let's bring in Paul Wallace. He is Bloomberg's MENA economy and government coverage lead, and he's joining us now from Dubai. So, Paul, it's been a stunning past few 48 hours. As we mentioned there, 50 years of the Assad regime, 13 years of civil war, all came down to the past 2 weeks. How did this happen so quickly?
Hi, Jennifer. I think that's a question so many people, foreign powers, and even Syrians are still grappling with. It is quite stunning just how fast this happened. I mean, Syria has gone from nowhere in terms of being in the news to the biggest story out there in less than 2 weeks because of how rapid the fall of Assad's government was. I think in the end, it came down to the sheer weakness of the Syrian military. I mean, apart from Aleppo, which was the first town the main rebels, the HTS took in late November, there wasn't really a fight. There wasn't really a fight for the city of Hama and then Homs further south and then Damascus. The Syrian military just melted away, and I think it shows just how hollow the Syrian government state institutions had become after so many years of civil war and rule under Bashar al-Assad. The other thing was that Iran and Russia, his two main backers, simply weren't willing or weren't able to help him in the way they did earlier in the civil war, when they really turned that conflict's tide in Assad's favor. There was also the issue of Hezbollah. It's been hugely weakened by Israel in the last few months. If it hadn't been, if it was still as strong as it was at the beginning of the year, maybe it would have been able to send fighters to Syria to help prop up Assad. But all those things didn't happen, and yeah, we're left with this extremely quick toppling of Assad's government.
And quite an unknown situation, Paul, right? I mean, we're hearing from a number of leaders talking about how they're hoping the transition will be potentially smooth. But what do we know about what the next transition, what the next government could potentially look like?
There are huge question marks over this. And if you look at Western powers, if you look at the US, if you look at European powers, Israel, most of them are obviously, or were obviously, they weren't friendly at all with Assad. And in normal circumstances, I think they would have been quite happy for him to have fallen. However, HTS, the group that's taken Damascus and seems to have effective power in Syria at the moment, is a group that broke away from al-Qaeda in 2016. It claims to have moderated its stance a lot since then, and it's saying that it will run some kind of inclusive government where all ethnicities and all religions will be safe. But still, it's a group that's designated a terrorist organization by the US and others in the West. So I think there's a huge amount of wariness about what comes next. We don't even know if HTS will end up running Syria or be the main power in Syria. I mean, the country is split between a huge number of, or large number of ruling groups. So I think in the next few months, it's going to be pretty messy. Probably these different groups sort of fighting, if not, physically, then fighting over trying to bolster their positions and things. And I think world powers are going to be watching on, just hoping that it's peaceful.
Paul Wallace, our thanks to you and the team for all of your reporting, leading our MENA economy and government coverage there. Thanks so much.
All right, joining us now at Abu Dhabi Finance Week is Syga Thomas, Geopolitical Strategist and CEO at Ensah Advisory Partners. Well, it's a great day to have you on to talk about everything that's happening in the region. I think so many people were taken aback at the speed of the demise of the Assad regime, but then equally lots of questions about what happens next and whether we could end up in a situation like Libya with many warring rival militias, or Afghanistan with the imposition of or return of a leadership like Taliban. What do you see happening with Syria? What conditions need to be in place to ensure that a Libya or an Afghanistan situation doesn't happen?
Good morning. Thanks for having me on. I think one of the first key issues is what type of legitimacy this rebel group is going to have. HTS, as we all know, are on several sanctions lists. They're on a terrorism watch list by the U.S., by Europe, and the United Nations. And what happens in those situations is, even though there may be a desire now by Western alliances to somehow provide support or engage in negotiations with this group, it's incredibly difficult, and it's very difficult to unwind. And so while HTS has certainly in the past few days have sent sort of positive statements and signs that they're willing to position themselves at a more moderate front, I think while that may be true, it's going to be harder to actually negotiate with Western powers when it comes to what they're able to accomplish in the next few months. I think what's also important is that they've made very positive statements. They said that they want Syrian organizations to stay in place, the prime minister to continue to lead. He's told his fighters not to touch government organizations. They want sort of the bureaucracy to stay in place until they're able to move on from that. So I think certainly it's going to lead towards some positive motivation for partners.
I was watching the language coming out of the UAE and Saudi Arabia very closely yesterday, because for so long, at least in the past year, the mantra has been stabilization in the region, de-escalation, and it was actually the UAE that re-invited Bashar al-Assad back to the Arab League in 2023. So it's not like they were the closest of friends, but at the same time there was an understanding that he was there and was providing some sort of stability, albeit under a regime of oppression. What do you think, or GCC nations, going to do at this point? Well, do you think they will have to play a more active role in what happens next with Syria?
I think that in general, in the last sort of few months or even the year, I think the GCC has recognized that they're going to have to play a more role, not just in Syria, but in the broader Middle East. And we're seeing that especially with what impact this is going to have Iran. I think what people are not talking about enough, while we all recognize the speed in which the rebel group was able to come to Damascus and Assad fleeing with his family to Russia, but what does this do for Iran? Iran, which traditionally used Syria as its basis to funnel weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon, now have no means to do so. Their axis of resistance is essentially eliminated. And so what type of position did that lead them into? President Trump has come in recently and said, Syria is not our friend. We're going to stay away from Syria. This is not our business. So Iran now is sitting back in a position where they're incredibly weakened. They're likely to engage and undergo more sanctions from the U.S. government. And so they're going to be left in a position where they're not going to have many options.
Yeah, all of us have been reporting on the fact that Iran is weakened. And I don't think it's a surprise for anyone to hear that has happened in the last few months with everything that's gone down, the tit for tat, the slow debilitation of their proxies around the region as well. But what is the next step for Iran? We say that Iran is on the back foot here. I mean, could we be talking about potential regime change in Iran? Does it go that far? Or is it just a matter of Iran re-engaging with the West again and providing concessions on the nuclear front?
I wouldn't go so far to see regime change at this point. I think we've all heard that Iran has quietly tried to reach out to the U.S. administration, the incoming U.S. administration. There are talks that are being had with them. I think on the immediate front, Iran sort of needs to look at two different issues. First, what does sanctions look like for them? How are they going to be able to increase sanctions because they're already under sanctions, but how are they going to be able to continue to have a decent enough economy to function? And more importantly, they're worried about protecting Iran. With their axis of resistance eliminated, what does that mean for them? That they look to nuclear weapons as a possible means? Does Israel go after more possible military targets in Iran? I think those are the things that Iran is worried about right now. I think culturally speaking, societally speaking, Iran's stronger than Syria, but certainly those are going to be things that they're going to be thinking about.
Yeah. What do you think happens once the Trump administration steps into office? It was interesting over the weekend, Trump was saying that he sort of wants to have a hands-off approach with Syria. Will he be able to have a hands-off approach with Syria given the sensitivities and that it has traditionally been a corridor from Iran to Hezbollah?
Yeah, Trump sent that message while the U.S. and Israel were launching sort of missiles into Syria against ISIS targets and potential chemical weapons. So, look, rhetoric is strong. It's obviously what he was able to sort of win the election on was sort of staying out of wars and not getting engaged in the Middle East. But whether Trump likes it or not, the U.S. has military forces in Syria, in the region. Yeah. They're going to have to be protected, and it's simply too volatile of a region to leave sort of laissez-faire and let happen what happens in the Middle East. The U.S., for better or worse, is going to have a say in what happens in Syria.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment. Syga, thank you so much. It was really great to have you on the show today. Syga Thomas, Geopolitical Strategist and CEO at Ensah Advisory Partners. Thank you. Well, coming up, pressure on the president. South Korea's Yoon Suk-yeol avoids impeachment, but calls for him to step down are still intensifying. We'll bring you the latest live from Seoul next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Shimana Bersachi in Abu Dhabi today. South Korean stocks have slumped as much as 2.4% as traders brace for volatility due to the deepening political turmoil. Yonhap News reports that police may seek the emergency arrest of President Yoon if conditions are met. The president managed to avoid impeachment over the weekend by a handful of votes, but pressure on him continues to intensify. Let's speak to Bloomberg's Shirian, who is in Seoul, has been on the ground. You were speaking to demonstrators over the weekend, so you've got a really good sense of public anger, I would say, Sherry. But let me just ask you what the latest is on Yoon's status, because I think many were surprised he actually survived that impeachment vote.
Yeah, I mean, it was such a close call, wasn't it? And it was such a dramatic and chaotic impeachment vote over the weekend. Right now, police are even saying that they're reviewing a potential travel ban against the president at the moment. You talked about a potential emergency arrest. Well, President Yoon has said, apologizing to the public, that he's going to take his hands off state affairs. He's already been investigated by prosecutors for treason. So there's a political vacuum right now at the top, and the ruling party PPP has stepped in, saying that the Prime Minister Han Duck-soo would be in charge of state affairs. But remember, here in South Korea, prime ministers only play a very nominal role when it comes to state affairs. He is a veteran politician. This is the second time that he's serving as Prime Minister of South Korea. He served under Roh Moo-hyun in 2007, who was also impeached and went through those proceedings. He went through the proceedings. He wasn't necessarily impeached, but basically to say that this is a common occurrence here in South Korea. We had the impeachment of Park Geun-hye back in 2016. Now, the key question is, will the opposition try to even remove Prime Minister Han Duck-soo? There's speculation that they might try to impeach him, which might be a lower bar than for the president.
Sherry, what is the opposition looking to do now? They clearly put forth this impeachment motion. They thought it was going to pass. They weren't successful. So how do they remobilize?
They needed 8 ruling lawmakers to vote with them to get that 2/3 majority of parliament to be able to impeach the president. They did not get that on Saturday. Right now, we're hearing that potentially they could try again on Saturday, but will they have the votes is a key question. And we have to keep in mind that this is a race against time for this person that you're watching right now, who's the main opposition Democratic Party leader, Lee Jae-myung. He is also been convicted by a court of election law violations. If that conviction is upheld, he's appealing that, then that would bar him from political life. I spoke to him last week, and he vowed to continue this pressure on President Yoon to have him removed. You talked about me being around with protesters. Well, yes, around the National Assembly, there were around 100,000 people, according to police estimates. We're expecting more protests tonight as well.
Yeah, well, just a fantastic set of developments in South Korea, Syria, just all around the world. It's great to have you on the ground in Seoul telling us what's going down. Bloomberg's The Asia Trade anchor, Sherry Ann, in Seoul. Now, coming up, a rapid response team has been dispatched to the DRC to help investigate the outbreak of a mysterious flu-like illness known as Disease X. We'll bring you the story next. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg. The World Health Organization is investigating a mysterious flu-like illness in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The WHO says over 400 reported cases and 31 deaths have so far been linked to the illness labeled Disease X. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Janice Q, who is our healthcare and consumer reporter, but has been following this story. So, Janice, the cause of this disease is still unknown. They don't really know a lot about what's happening with it. But what do we know about what's been spreading?
So cases have been reported since late October. We're talking about 6 weeks already, which is a bit of a concern because that's a fair time lapse in terms of actually getting diagnostics done. We know that there are flu-like symptoms, so we're thinking fever, headache, runny nose, body ache, those sort of things. Most of the cases have been amongst children younger than 5 years old, and all the severe cases are people who are malnourished. This is a very remote area, and so getting the diagnostics done in a country which is already diagnostic abilities are fairly limited is tricky. It's about 48 hours from Congo, the province that this is happening in, to the capital, and so getting all sorts of other medical supplies is also very difficult. We do know that there are teams on the ground, so that is comforting.
But Janice, I mean, earlier this year we were talking about Mpox, and there was the concern about how it was spreading. How is this potentially different? Are there ways that potentially this can be contained and it's not as much of a concern? I wonder how you'd paint that picture.
So with Mpox, it's not airborne, and this we don't know yet if it's airborne, but it might well be because of the flu-like symptoms, which suggests that. So a non-airborne disease often spreads slower, which Mpox was or is, and this might spread more easily. However, because it's such a remote area, and there aren't a lot of thoroughfares or routes going elsewhere, That does reduce risk. And the Congo is exceptionally good at dealing with infectious diseases. They've had Ebola and all sorts of other things. So that is a mitigating factor. There's also the fact that it may already be this unknown disease might actually be something that just hasn't been identified yet because of the slowness with testing. And so it could be something that's already known, like COVID-19, flu, pneumonia, even measles and malaria. Malaria is very prevalent in the area. So it could be something like that. It could also be a multiple number of diseases that are just showing in this way, because these symptoms, while severe, I mean, there have been a number of deaths. They aren't uncommon to a variety of existing illnesses.
Right, so we're still waiting to get a few of those details. Appreciate your reporting there. That's Bloomberg's healthcare and consumer reporter, Janice Q, joining us here in Johannesburg.
Fascinating. Certainly seems like something we need to keep an eye on, a mystery illness. Nobody needs that right now. Okay, let's check on market futures, equity futures. As we get closer and closer to the start of the European session, it's leaning with a risk-off bias. And here you can see all of the major indices are tilting towards the red. The Euro Stoxx down about 0.2%, even though once again we saw U.S. equities end the week on a high last week. Well, coming up, after more than 50 years, the Assad rule in Syria has ended. We'll get more analysis on what this means for the country and the wider region.
This is Horizons Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Syria's Bashar al-Assad flees to Moscow after a stunningly fast advance by opposition groups topples his regime. The end of 50 years of the Assad family's rule leaves a power vacuum, raising concerns of more turmoil and violence. Israeli ground forces reportedly cross into Syrian territory for the first time since the 1973 October War. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the collapse of the Assad regime offers, quote, a great opportunity. And Korean stocks and the won slide as pressure intensifies on President Yoon to step down despite avoiding impeachment. Police reportedly saying he could face arrest under certain conditions. It has just gone 7:30 a.m. here in South Africa. I'm Jennifer Zapasacha in Johannesburg.
And I'm Jumana Versace in Abu Dhabi, where it's just gone 9:30 a.m. We are here for Abu Dhabi Finance Week, and this is the second hour of Horizons Middle East and Africa.
That's right. And you've already been bringing us a number of great interviews, Jumana. We know that will continue. But let's take a quick look at where markets are positioned. At the beginning of this week, U.S. equities, starting with them, little changed right now. But that is after a week where we did see both the S&P and the NASDAQ closing at fresh records, actually posting their third straight week of gains. But if you take a look at the S&P there right now, little change as it stands. We're also paying close attention to the Kospi. Avraham will talk more about that in just a bit, but clearly down significantly right now. We're paying close attention to what is happening about those developments in Korea. Gold is also in focus. It is up just over 0.1% there at 2,636 an ounce. That is coming after we saw China's central bank expanding its gold reserves in November, ending a 6-month pause. And of course, close attention to what is happening geopolitically and potentially why gold is getting a bit of a boost. And we have oil as well. Brent crude edging higher, almost 0.5% up, about $71.47 a barrel. And that is coming after we did see the collapse of the Syrian government over the weekend. But last week we did see Brent closing its second weekly loss. Potentially the uncertainty that we're seeing geopolitically has some more effect on what we see with crude. And it is a busy week ahead with monetary policy decisions. We do have a Chinese policy meeting, and of course we have the U.S. CPI print on Wednesday ahead of the Fed meeting next week. But if we take a look at what inflation has showed, this chart is illustrating short-term inflation potentially a bit stickier. It's picking up with both the 3-month and the 6-month annualized reading above 2%. Investors watching closely, though, what we see with that print on Wednesday and what then that could potentially mean for the Fed's meeting next week. Let's, though, check in on how markets in Asia are faring. There's a lot of developments happening there. Avril Hong is standing by in our Singapore studio. Avril, how's it going?
Yeah, against that backdrop of these developments happening, we're seeing South Korea and Chinese stocks. Those are the ones that are underperforming today. But I thought I'd just encapsulate or recap the data that we got out of Asia's largest economy. We got consumer inflation in China, worse than expected, an unexpected slowing. And we also saw the factory gate deflation for 26 months. So overall, it's adding to the sense that whatever has been thrown at the Chinese economy from policymakers is just not enough to revive things. Our colleagues at Bloomberg Economics have the view that that key economic conference that's set to be underway this week is a chance for policymakers to signal stimulus. That being said, that the growth target or more concrete policy plans, that's going to come at a later date. In the meantime, what we can potentially expect is a cut to the reserve requirement ratio by the end of the year, 25 basis points. That's expected by our team at Bloomberg Economics, and that's perhaps being reflected, those policy stimulus expectations being reflected in Chinese bonds that have just been surging. We see the yield on the 10-year in China hitting levels we haven't seen in about 20 years. That's about 1.93 at the moment. So this is what we're seeing in Asia, specifically in China, guys.
Thanks so much, Avril Hong in Singapore for us. Now back to our top story. And after more than half a century, the Assad ruling dynasty in Syria has ended. Bashar al-Assad has been toppled in a lightning rebel advance, forcing the 59-year-old to flee Damascus and seek refuge in Moscow. Back in 2011, the so-called Arab Spring reached Syria, but Assad managed to hang on to power against a backdrop of a brutal civil war. But now the collapse of the regime has left a power vacuum with concerns about more upheaval and potentially violence. Now, to unpack all of this for us, Bloomberg's Sam Dagger is joining us now. Sam, you've been watching this very closely. We've been following your reporting. Talk to us about where you see this going from here and what you're focused on with a number of these threads that we're talking about as a result of the Assad regime being toppled.
Well, thank you for having me. I think it's very important to note that while, legitimately, the world is concerned about what comes next, but I think the world also needs to keep in mind, what Syrians are going through at the moment. They've been liberated. This is what my Syrian friends are telling me. I've been speaking to them over the past 48 hours, and their feeling is they're still trying to get their bearings. They've been liberated from this family that has ruled the country for over half a century. You had the father, al-Assad. He came to power in a coup in 1970, and he managed to put in place one of the most brutal regimes in the world, underpinned by this cult of personality, repression, and zero tolerance for any dissent. And then they rose up against his son, who basically inherited power from his dad in 2000, in 2011 during the Arab Spring. And the protests were peaceful, but they were met with bullets. And then it basically escalated into this huge war with outside players, and then a death toll of anywhere between 300,000 to 500,000 people, and half the country of 24 million displaced internally or in neighboring countries. And then you have 100,000 Syrians, at least, who have been forcibly displaced by the regime. Literally, when the dungeons of the security services were being opened, and these large prisons where people were being held, people were coming out. Some of them had been there for 30, 40 years. They'd been imprisoned under the dad. Right. And some people who had thought that their loved ones had died, even the government told them that your loved one is dead, and they found out that no, they're still alive. So we have to keep this in mind, I think, as we obviously assess, what comes next.
Right. The humanitarian aspect of this is very important, and it's fascinating, some of the pictures that you're seeing actually coming out of Syria. Sam, when we think about, you mentioned neighboring countries, we've seen a number of leaders speaking and reacting to this last night, President Biden, as well as President-elect Trump and others reacting. Who do you think steps in to potentially help or aid in this transition? We did hear President-elect Trump saying that he doesn't want to see the U.S. involved, but who do you think then potentially helps ease the potential turmoil that we could see?
I mean, I know President-elect Trump says he doesn't want to be involved, but I mean, I hate to say it, the U.S. will have to be involved. Western countries will have to be involved, particularly France, Germany, the UK. But obviously, the lead role here is going to be for Turkey. Behind it, Russia. I mean, albeit Russia now is weakened it has a naval base, it has an air base, but its man on the ground now is in Moscow. So it's a different dynamic. So it's going to be liaising with the Turks. Then you have Israel, which is making some very bold moves now. I mean, we have these reports that has entered into Syria, and it has also sent signals that it is worried about, these rebels whom Israeli officials describe as no friends of Israel. It is also worried that these rebels may get their hands on weapons. Also, it has signaled that it feels a lot more comfortable with a lot of these minorities in Syria, like the Druze, at the Israeli border, the Kurds in the northeast. So this is going to complicate, the situation.
Bloomberg, Sam Dagger, always great to get your reporting and your insights. Really appreciate you joining us this morning.
My pleasure.
Well, let's continue the analysis now with Dalia Fahmy, Director of International Relations and Diplomacy and Associate Professor of Political Science at Long Island University. Good morning to you, Dalia. One of the things, alongside the speed of the demise of the Assad regime, was also just how relatively peaceful it was. And even when the rebels approached some of the big cities, even Damascus over the weekend, it was still relative peaceful transition of power, especially after reports emerged that Assad had actually fled the country. Do you expect this superficial peace to last?
You know, Jemana, it's a remarkable moment in Arab Middle East history because, save probably World War II and the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, this is probably one of the most critical moments because it marks the end of the longest-standing military-based, foreign-backed, family-anchored autocratic regime. It really marks the end of an era in the Arab world. And what we saw in the past 12 days was unexpected and both expected. Because if you think about 2011 and the Arab Spring, what you saw happen in Egypt and in Tunisia and in much of North Africa and Levant was a people uprising. And save where they are today, what we saw in Syria, the response of March 2011, when a young child, school child, spray painted on the wall of a school in Daraa in Syria, "Doctor, you are next." Doctor meaning Bashar al-Assad, because he's an eye doctor. We expected that it was going to fall similar to the way Egypt and Tunisia did. But what we saw was a heavy-handed response that led to the death of 500,000 Syrians, the displacement of 14 million. And a civil war that erupted also critically in 2016 that really laid the groundwork for what we saw today. Because the 2016 moment of the rise of the leader of the resistance that established the 12 days was long in coming. So both surprising and unexpected.
Yeah, many people are saying, experts are saying that the fact that the Assad regime fell so quickly was also a reflection of not just the weakness of the Assad regime, but also the lack of appetite from Syria's traditional allies to help bolster him. And we talk about Iran being on the back foot politically, its proxies around the region as well having suffered blows the last few months, Russia embroiled in a war with Ukraine. If that is the case, what does that do to the broader dynamics, the geopolitical dynamics of the region? The fact that it's not just the Assad regime that is gone, but many of its supporters as well are going to be less present there.
Absolutely. So when you have a weakened Russia in the region, so the reason why this is not 2016 and the Assad regime was able to fall was because Iran and Russia are not what they used to be. With Russia in this quagmire in Ukraine and Iran increasingly weakened and not wanting to establish a deeper footprint in the region for several strategic reasons, it led to the rise of, for example, Turkey in the region, especially in this moment in Syria, but also the backing was not there for the Syrian military. And so what you saw was this critical moment a few days ago where you start to see uniforms being abandoned by the Syrian military. And so it created a kind of threshold effect where it was, wait, the backing is not coming. It is not here. This is a brave new world. It's a new day. And so the Syrian military was quickly therefore removed. But it begs the question of what's really going to happen in the region. What is the road ahead going to fall? Syria is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, sectarian country. It's learned the lessons of the de-Baathification of Iraq, but it's also learned the lessons of Lebanon's civil war. And so when we see, for example, today that Israel has moved into Syria's buffer zone, the U.S. has announced airstrikes, and ISIL has already struck parts of Syria. Russia and Iran are weakened. We're going to see Syria be the next space for contestation over regional security, but Turkey is going to increasingly try to establish a stronger foothold.
Yeah, and let me just bring you back to something you were saying about Lebanon. Of course, there is this somewhat shaky ceasefire right now between Lebanon and Israel. How do you think the dynamics over the weekend, what's happened in Syria, could have ramifications on what happens within Lebanon, not just in the context of the ceasefire, but also in terms of state building?
You know, I'm here in Doha where the foreign ministers of Iran, Turkey, and Russia are. We're here in the same forum. And it was very interesting to see them the day before the fall of Assad and the day of the fall of Assad, because the language of the future became very, very bleak and dark, and also kind of interesting about how this is going to reflect on places like Lebanon and the immediacy. Is there going to be an ability for places like Iran to hold on to the of stability of what's happening in Lebanon? That's increasingly not true. We saw Hezbollah, for example, take a critical step back. And so I think the ramifications of what happened in Syria yesterday are going to have a lot of reverberation for both Lebanon, Gaza, and the future of Turkey in the region, but furthermore, the kind of backtracking of Iran into a different space.
Dalia, thank you so much, and definitely looking forward to having you come on in future months to help us analyze and dissect exactly what is going to happen from here. Dalia Fahmy, Director of International Relations and Diplomacy and Associate Professor of Political Science at Long Island University. Thank you. Well, coming up, slightly different tact. Red Bull's team principal, Christian Horner, spoke to me about the prospect of Saudi Arabia entering the Formula One race and building a new circuit. More from my exclusive interview next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Versace in Abu Dhabi for the Abu Dhabi Finance Week. Well, it's been a busy weekend in Abu Dhabi with the Formula One Grand Prix season closer descending on the city. Yesterday was the last race of the season. Red Bull's Sergio Perez had a race to forget after he was forced to retire early from the race, with Lando Norris taking the constructor's title for McLaren. I spoke exclusively with Red Bull team principal Christian Horner, who the team and Perez will reflect on the season that's been after a tough season.
2025 promises to be a really exciting year. It's the last year of this regulations. We've seen the cars and the teams converging in performance. There's now 4 teams, in Red Bull, in McLaren, in Mercedes, and of course Ferrari, that will all be competing for wins next year. And it'll be fascinating to see how Lewis adapts to life with arguably the most famous team in Formula One.
Let me ask you about your own lineup. You mentioned some of the issues that Sergio Perez was having. A few people are asking about what's going to happen with his contract. Can you give us visibility?
Well, it's obviously difficult to go into the details of drivers' contracts, but this year's been very tough for Sergio. Nobody more than Sergio will accept that. So for us, we'll reflect on the season after this last race. He's been an incredible member of our team for the 4 years that he's been with us so far, and 5 victories, second in last year's Drivers' World Championship, contributing to 2 Constructors' World Championship, and of course Max's first Drivers' World Championship here in Abu Dhabi. So he's a popular member of the team, he's a valued member of the team, but it's been a tough year, and we'll sit down after this race and reflect on the season it's been.
This year there have been 24 races. Do you think that's too many?
I think 24 is a lot. I mean, it's like it's a tough season for all the travelling staff, and you get to a point where at some point you reach saturation. I think 24 is right on the limit. I don't think we can go certainly beyond that. For me, 21's a great number. I'd rather go for quality over quantity, but of course, which ones do you drop, because they're all fantastic races?
Yeah, well, that brings me to my next question. The Middle East obviously have a growing presence in Formula One. There's even talk of Saudi Arabia wanting to get involved as well. New tracks in the US. Is Europe becoming less relevant in the grand scheme of things in terms of where these races take place?
Well, I think we only have 7 or 8 races in Europe now. When you look back 15 or 20 years, Europe was the dominant factor on the calendar. So Europe has become ever smaller, but you can imagine that certain European races will come under pressure because all these different countries and regions want to have the presence of Formula One, not only the spotlight that it brings on that country for the weekend that the race is hosted there, but of course the economic benefit that it brings into town with the travelling circus that is Formula One.
Do you think it would make sense for Saudi Arabia to bring in a Formula One?
Well, Saudi Arabia obviously have their street race in Jeddah, but there's obviously talk of them building a really exciting new circuit, which could be something a bit special.
The Democratic Republic of Congo is facing a severe food crisis due to war, disease, and drought. The World Food Program says more than 40% of the country's 100 million people are short of food. The organization says it needs $350 million in the next 6 months to support affected communities across southern and central Africa. For more on this, let's bring in Bloomberg's Ndiro Oganga, who is joining us from Kigali. So, Ndiro, how dire is this situation? Paint the story for us.
Jen, the situation is quite dire. If you look at DRC, about 25 million people are at risk. And this is a country, over the last 3 decades, there's been infighting that has left 7 million people displaced. And the government has spent large chunks of its budget on security. And this is taking away from key sectors such as agriculture and healthcare. And it has left them susceptible and vulnerable to shocks such as drought. If you look at Zambia, they declared a national state of emergency and disaster after poor rainfall that has left 1 million people at the risk of hunger. The case is the same in Zimbabwe, where 70% of their maize production failed, and this has left about 57% of rural population at risk of hunger. The country says this is the worst drought that they've ever seen in 40 years. And just to contextualize that, WFP says that the situation goes and defies any form of human decency. We're seeing them struggling to raise money. Of the 480 million that they need, they've only raised about 108 million. And so this is going to slow down the relief efforts that they could offer, because there's so many global emergencies that are going on, and it's stretching aid from donors really thin.
And Ndiro, maybe in just a few seconds, talk to us about some of the intervention measures that we're seeing.
Briefly, Jen, if we look at Zimbabwe, this time around, the minister was telling Bloomberg that they decided to open their borders and allow traders to import food so that there can be access. The main point of concern is affordability is no longer an option, because we've seen maize prices escalate by up to 150%. So in places where there's no food, traders are allowed to import, but locals cannot afford it. And everybody is now forced to lean on aid organizations such as WFP.
Great reporting. Bloomberg's Ndiro Ganga in Kigali for us there with the latest in Congo. Thanks so much, Ndiro. All right, that is it for Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasanja in Johannesburg. Stick with us for Daybreak Europe. That's next. This is Bloomberg.